2.
Hi, I'm Amanda Little, and I'm a professor of journalism and science writing at Vanderbilt University and a columnist for Bloomberg with a focus on climate, technology, and agriculture. I'm also the author of The Fate of Food: What We'll Eat in a Bigger, Hotter, Smarter World. In the past year, we've lived through a historic global trauma, a pandemic that exposed the vulnerability of human health, of ecosystems, of supply chains, and of our global food supply. This is a moment when it has never been more important to connect and collaborate internationally so that together we can address the problems that loom ahead, most notably climate change and the challenge of feeding humanity in an environmentally volatile world. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to connect with you and share my research on climate and agriculture, the impacts of environmental volatility on agriculture, and the solutions that are emerging to address them. The central paradox of our food future is this. Global population is expected to increase to nearly 10 billion people by mid-century. Growing middle classes around the world are demanding more diverse and protein-dense diets. But meanwhile, arable land is decreasing. The International Panel on Climate Change has predicted a decline in arable land of 2 to 6% every decade going forward. That doesn't sound like much, but it's millions of acres of land going offline every decade while population climbs. The International Panel on Climate Change predicted in a recent report, and I quote, that by mid-century, the world may reach a threshold of global warming beyond which current agricultural practices can no longer support large human civilizations. So we're going to see radical changes in what we grow and how we eat in the coming decades as these environmental and population pressures intensify. I spent the past 5 years investigating these changes, and I learned this. It was a quote from Tim Gore, who works on food security at Oxfam. He said, "The main way that most people will experience climate change is through its impact on food systems. What they eat, how it's grown, and the price they pay for it, and the availability and choice they have." One scientist at the United States Department of Agriculture put it to me this way: the single biggest threat of climate change is the collapse of food systems. All of this sounds like a distant problem, but disruptions in food supply are evident almost everywhere. In the past year and a half, the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed and accelerated the vulnerabilities in our food systems. In the US, we saw the dumping of billions of pounds of fruits and vegetables in some regions, while in other regions, thousands of carloads of hungry families lined up for free meals at food banks. Outside the US, especially in the Middle East and in Southeastern Africa, COVID-19 accelerated food insecurity and has pushed some countries into famines. But going forward, the pressures of climate change on food producers will be more chronic and complex than anything we saw during the pandemic. This summer, we saw record-setting droughts and heat waves destroy farms throughout the American West, including cattle and dairy farms and century-old vineyards. We saw withering heat damage avocado and almond and strawberry farms and lettuce production. In the next 30 years, the severity of drought in the United States is expected to almost triple. The impacts of climate change on food production are evident everywhere in rich countries, in emerging economies. There are no regions of the world and no types of crops that aren't experiencing climate pressures in some way. Consider the devastating floods in Germany this summer that literally swallowed up farms. And last year in South Korea, which has a very productive and innovative economy and a very secure food supply. Remember that last year extreme weather events wiped out cabbage production, causing prices for cabbage and kimchi to surge more than 60%. And for every obvious impact of climate change on food production, there are also subtle impacts. Like this image of apple blossoms at a farm I visited in Wisconsin. It shows the impact of shifting seasons on the orchard. This was a problem of a warm winter, which caused an early budding of the apple blossoms, followed by a normal freeze event in spring, which destroyed the premature crop. This one small farmer lost millions of dollars of apple production in about 5 minutes from that one freeze. So there's so many varied pressures, right? We have drought, we have heat, we have flooding and superstorms, we have invasive insects and bacterial blights, there's weather volatility. The threats are region-specific, which makes it hard to research and a very hard story to tell. But it all adds up if you connect the dots to a single story. And the story is that climate change is becoming a problem we can taste. This is a kitchen table issue in the literal sense. Our challenge going forward is twofold. We have to solve the existing problems of industrial agriculture while preparing for the pressures ahead. Remember that while climate change is posing a huge threat to agriculture, it's also a major driver of the climate problem. And agriculture produces about 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions. No industry has more significantly altered land and water use over the past century, much less the past 13,000 years since the beginning of civilization, than agriculture. Yet no industry is more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change than agriculture, which means that food producers are uniquely motivated to come up with solutions, to convert from environmental sinners to environmental saints, which makes it a really exciting area of innovation and adaptation. Let's just look at some of the environmental pressures caused by agriculture so you have some context for all this. Food production is contingent on a stable water supply. And climate change is fundamentally a disturbance in hydrology. You have too much water in some regions, too little water in other regions, and 70% of the total fresh water supply on planet Earth consumed by humans flows to agriculture. So when you have disturbances in fresh water supply, it inevitably causes problems with food production. And meat consumption in particular is very water dependent. And puts a huge burden on the environment. A single pound of beef takes on average about 1,800 gallons of water to produce, and a lot of that water is flowing into the crops that feed the cattle. In fact, 1/3 of grains produced globally feed livestock. So again, when corn and soy production is disrupted, for example, so is meat production. And humanity eats a lot of meat. In the last 50 years, global population has doubled and meat consumption has tripled. It's astounding to me as a meat consumer to look at the global data and to recognize that 160 million tons of seafood are consumed annually by the global population. 50 billion chickens are consumed, and 5 billion cattle pigs, goats, and sheep. It's a big burden and it's a major consideration. And I'm someone who consumes meat and I rely on a lot of imported foods. And my own challenges with trying to become a virtuous eater and a vegetarian caused me to wonder, how are we going to fix the problems in our food system? The existing problems and the ones that are coming in the years and decades ahead. How are we going to build a climate-resilient food supply? And that question launched a 5-year globe-trekking journey into the lands and the machines and the minds that are shaping the future of sustainable food. The result is my book, The Fate of Food. And I chronicle this journey that took me through 13 countries and 15 states, from apple orchards in Wisconsin to tiny cornfields in Kenya to massive Norwegian fish farms and computerized foodscapes in Shanghai. My journey took me through the past and through the present and the future. I investigated new and old ideas, from robotics and CRISPR and vertical farms to edible insects and permaculture and fermentation and ancient plants. I began to see that farmers and entrepreneurs and academics are radically rethinking national and global food systems to make them resilient and sustainable. There's a growing controversy about the best way to ensure food security in the US. Bill Gates has said that food is ripe for reinvention, that we should put huge flows of funding into new methods of high-tech and climate-smart agriculture. But many sustainable food activists are also saying, no, I don't want technology in my food. They bristle at the idea of reinvention. They want food de-invented, right? They advocate for a return to pre-industrial, traditional, pre-green revolution, organic farming that has existed for centuries. And this is the reinvention camp and the de-invention camp have been fighting for a long time, for decades, but it's becoming a more and more heated battle. One side covering the past, one side saying, let's go back to traditional agriculture, and one side saying, let's go forward. Let's go forward into very advanced agriculture. And as someone observing this debate, I began to wonder, why must it be so binary? Why can't we do both? Neither approach on its own will work. We need a synthesis of the two. And that's beginning to happen. Innovators are marrying principles of old world agroecology and bringing in state-of-the-art technologies to create what I call a third way of food production. A synthesis of traditional approaches and the radically new. It's an opportunity to use the most sophisticated technologies of our time to support and elevate traditional practices and sustainability principles, not compete with them. So we want to improve and scale our harvests while restoring, rather than degrading, the underlying web of life, the soil health that gives rise to an abundant food supply. I want to take you through some examples of this third way thinking in agriculture. And some of these you'll be familiar with, and some may sound shockingly unfamiliar. First, I want you to meet Jorge Herrod. He's a Peruvian-born engineer who lives in Silicon Valley. Excuse me. First, I want you to meet Jorge Herrod. He's a Peruvian-born engineer who lives in Silicon Valley. And his company, Blue River Technology, invented artificially intelligent robots called See and Spray that can weed crops with sniper-like precision. And when I first went to see the maiden voyage of these robots in a field in Arkansas in the middle of the United States, I thought I was going to encounter kind of a battalion of C-3PO style robots who marched into the field with pincer hands to pluck the weeds among the crops. And instead I encountered this tractor pulling this big white umbrella off the back of it. And under that white shield are 24 cameras that use computer vision to see the ground beneath it and distinguish between the crops and the weeds. And then they can deploy with sniper-like precision these tiny jets of fertilizer, concentrated fertilizer or herbicide that can incinerate the baby weeds. And it's an incredible advantage for farmers who want to cut down on the costs of agrochemicals, of course, and the human health impacts of herbicides and agrochemicals. And it can reduce the practice of broadcast spraying, which is dumping herbicides across an entire field, by about 90%. So huge cost savings, huge human health advantages, and big climate advantages. But the bigger picture is even more exciting. Intelligent machines can treat plants individually, right? Applying not just herbicides, but also pesticides and fungicides and fertilizers on a plant-by-plant rather than field-by-field basis. So eventually, this kind of hyper-specific farming can allow for more diversity and intercropping on fields so that big farms can begin to mimic the small-scale sustainable agriculture that is going on, that they can mimic natural systems and improve soil health and diversity. So Jorge Herod is the very embodiment of third way thinking. Robots, he told me, don't have to remove us from nature. They can help us restore it. Increasing crop diversity will be crucial to building resilient food systems. And Jorge Herod's innovations in precision farming can dramatically decrease agrochemical use, which is a boon to human health, to soil health, and to the climate. And the more healthy your soil, the more capacity it has to sequester carbon and draw down greenhouse gases. So as we, I'm going to read.
Okay.
Increasing crop diversity will be crucial to building resilient food systems. And Jorge Herod's innovations in precision farming help reduce agrochemical use, which is a boon to human health, to ecosystems, and to the climate. It was also going to be crucial going forward to decentralize food production so that when producers in one region are disrupted by a storm or a drought, the other producers in neighboring regions can continue growing. The rise of vertical farms, like this facility inside a former steel mill in Newark, New Jersey, can play an important role in decentralized food production that can occur in and near cities and population centers. This is an aeroponic facility that mists the roots of plants with moisture and nutrients, and it uses 95% less water than in-field vegetable production, and it can grow about 40% faster. So more food can be grown inside the space of a soccer goal than can be grown in the space of a soccer field outdoors. And when located in and near cities, these vertical farms can eliminate huge amounts of trucking and food waste. It struck me, I have to admit, as kind of creepy and troubling to imagine fruits and vegetables being grown without soil and sun. But after weeks of exploring these plant factories, I came to see it as oddly, even perfectly natural to deliver to plants the moisture and nutrients that they need and no more than what they need. No over-applications of water, no over-applications of fertilizer, which is rampant in industrial agriculture. And there are zero herbicides alongside radical efficiency. So here again, we see technology supporting and elevating the wisdom of natural ecosystems and healthy food production. We also need to look at innovations in meat production, given what I discussed earlier as the huge environmental burdens of meat production. Developments in plant-based and alternative meats are profoundly hopeful, and they follow a similar trend toward local, resilient, and low-carbon protein production. There's even promise in the future of lab-grown or cell-based meats. Uma Valetti served me my first plate of lab-grown duck breast harvested from a bioreactor. And a bioreactor is basically a really sophisticated crock pot. Just keeps warm solutions that feed replicating cells. So these meats are grown from a small sample of muscle and fat cells that are given a controlled environment to do what cells naturally do, which is replicate. The cell-based meats have very little threat of bacterial contamination, up to 85% lower CO2 emissions, and eventually, like the produce that's grown in those indoor vertical farms, they can be grown, these proteins can be grown without any threat of supply chain disruption. Uma Valetti started out as a cardiologist who understood that doctors have been growing animal tissues for decades for medical applications. And he wondered, if we're growing these tissues for, let's say, a heart transplant, why don't we grow them for agricultural use? So like Herod, Uma Valetti is a quintessential third-way thinker, right? He's reimagined an old idea using new technology to usher in a solution whose time has come. Billions of dollars are now flowing into cultured meat startups that are producing everything from beef to seafood. And it tastes exactly like meat because it is meat. It's grown with all the flavor and nutrients of animal meat, but also with radical efficiency. It's identical on a cellular level to the meat we harvest from live animals. But it's grown without the inhumane conditions. It's grown without the bones and the organs and the feathers and all that we don't consume for human nourishment. It's also grown without the sentience of live animals. I want to add very briefly just a bit on this emerging area of blue tech or water technology, the effort to develop new sources of fresh water supplies so we can survive through droughts and continue supplying water to urban centers and farms during droughts. I visited a facility, a recycled wastewater facility, also called toilet to tap water, in Orange County, California, that is converting sewage into hyper pure drinking water using reverse osmosis membranes. I drank water that hours earlier had been raw sewage, and I have to tell you that it tasted as good as anything I've had from the Swiss Alps. Nearby this recycled sewage facility in Carlsbad, California, was a desalination plant that is stripping salt from ocean brine and using the same reverse osmosis membranes to strip out impurities to produce hyper pure drinking water that can also supply farms in times of drought. And these are expensive alternatives to conventional water produced at treatment plants, but they're becoming increasingly cost competitive. And they call it organic water because these membranes use mechanical means to strip out impurities rather than the chemicals that are used at conventional treatment plants. So you have another example, a response to environmental pressures, to climate pressures, using innovation that are creating better products that solve problems that go well beyond climate change. Throughout my research, I've met dozens of scientists and engineers who emulate third-way thinking. They're using state-of-the-art technologies not to damage or destroy sustainable food systems, but to learn from and help support them. They're using modern breeding tools to create nutritious heirloom crops that can withstand drought and heat and flooding. They're making fish farming, also known as aquaculture, sustainable. They're finding ways to eliminate food waste. They're using drones and soil sensors and big data to grow crops with incredible precision and fewer inputs. They're also using technology to expand conservation agriculture that mimics those natural ecosystems, as I said before, improving soil health, draws down more carbon dioxide and locks it into the soil. And this is crucial going forward. All told, the world's farmlands may be able to sequester as much carbon dioxide as the total amount emitted from the transportation sector, and nearly as much as the global electricity industry. So agriculture has the capacity not just to cut down on CO2 emissions, but actually to become a major solution to CO2 emissions, drawing down and locking in that carbon dioxide into the soil as healthy carbon that nourishes the soil. There are also innovators who are working to revive ancient nutrient-dense plants. They're finding ways to recycle sewage and gray water and develop these drought-proof water supplies. They're developing smart water networks that eliminate leaks and bursts in the underground water pipelines that can be so wasteful. They're developing micro-irrigation systems and local sustainable protein supplies that can feed famine-stricken regions around the world. The upshot is this: human innovation in response to climate change that marries old and new approaches to food production can, and I believe will, redefine sustainable food on a grand scale. Thank you so much.